All right. Hello, boys and girls. Today we're going to talk about the lymphatic system. So you're probably at the end of learning about the cardiovascular system. And I'm going to do a hopefully fairly short overview for you of the lymphatic system. We're not going to get into a lot of gory details, and you'll see how the lymphatic system cooperates with the cardiovascular system to keep your tissues nice and healthy and to prevent the buildup of excess fluid in those tissues. All right, what is the lymphatic system? Now, we're all familiar with lymph nodes. We're all familiar with those when they get swollen in places like in our neck. However, you may not be completely familiar with the idea that the lymphatic system is a system of lymphatic vessels, little tubes, that extend all throughout your body to almost every tissue. And kind of like your cardiovascular system, where you have blood vessels of all different sizes down to those little microscopic capillaries that extend throughout almost all of your tissues. Same thing with the lymphatic system. You have little microscopic ones that extend into almost all of your tissues, serve almost all of those tissues, and then those lead to bigger and bigger and bigger lymphatic vessels, which then extend to your lymph nodes, and we'll learn more about what those do, what their function is. And those are your two main components of your lymphatic system. And then you have the lymph, and that is the fluid that is flowing through this lymphatic system. And over here you just have kind of a generic diagram from your textbook. We'll come back and take a closer look at this later, but this is showing you throughout your body where you have some of these larger lymphatic vessels and the associated lymph nodes that occur in various locations along those larger lymphatic vessels. All right, what does this lymphatic system do? What does it do? We've heard about it, but sometimes, sometimes we may not have a very good feel yet for what that system's role is in the function of our body. So if you read right here, the job of your lymphatic system, one of the key jobs is to return interstitial fluids or tissue fluids, leaked plasma proteins that have exited the bloodstream and now need to be returned to the bloodstream, back to the blood. Return these things back to the blood, and we'll talk about why that's necessary. And really, your lymph fluids that are flowing through your lymphatic vessels throughout your body, all that really is, it's the same fluid that you have in your tissues, those interstitial fluids, the extracellular fluids between the cells of your tissues. Same stuff, it's just that once it enters these lymphatic vessels, it's called lymph. Another key thing, that's one thing. Another key thing is the lymphatic system, especially your lymph nodes and some other types of tissues that we'll talk about, like your tonsils, for example, provide the structural basis of the immune system. So you have cells of your immune system that lurk in some of these tissues, and the reason for that is because that is a great place for them to intercept microorganisms, microbes like bacteria and viruses that are invading your body. So that's another key role of the lymphatic system. Another thing to keep in mind, these lymph fluids, they flow in one direction. They're flowing from a tissue and back to the bloodstream. So it's a one-way. It's not a circulation. You don't have lymphatic fluids that just circulate throughout your body like your blood does. Your blood is a circulation. Lymph flow is a one-way type flow. And as it's flowing from tissues to the bloodstream, it gets filtered along the way. This fluid is filtered. Let's get rid of any bacteria or viruses, we hope, that are draining off of your tissues before those little critters can go to deeper parts of your body and cause major problems. All right, this diagram from your textbook, I'm going to try to explain here the purpose of these lymph vessels and the associated lymph nodes and so forth that make up your lymphatic system. Okay, so hopefully you kind of recognize this type of diagram. You've seen that already. This is showing you a generic tissue somewhere in your body. This could be the dermis of your skin. It might be the wall of a major organ. But it's just consider this a generic tissue, and of course you have cells in there, and you have spaces between those cells and various tissues of your body, and those spaces contain, you have those interstitial fluids in there. And hopefully by now you have learned, now in red and blue and purple here, we have a good old capillary bed like you've already been learning about. And hopefully you guys know by now that when you have a capillary bed in a tissue, you have arterioles, small tiny arteries that are bringing oxygen, nutrients. I know I'm writing like a kindergartner. Bringing nutrients and oxygen into that capillary bed. That blood is spreading all through there. Because of the hydrostatic pressure, remember that, because of your hydrostatic pressure on this end of the capillary bed, the hydrostatic pressure, the fluid pressure inside the capillary bed at that point is high, and so that tends to push plasma, the blood fluid, out of the capillaries and into the surrounding tissue. So that's hydrostatic pressure. It pushes fluids out. And also a lot of the associated solutes, things that are dissolved in that fluid. The oxygen gas, glucose, amino acids, all that kind of good stuff that all these cells in this tissue needs. Then hopefully you've learned that over on the other side of the capillary bed, over here, I'm going to erase that. Over here on this side of your capillary bed, the hydrostatic pressure is lower at that point than it is over here on this side. And so over here on this side, you have a tendency for fluids, interstitial fluid, to move back into the capillary bed. And that's mainly due to the osmotic pressure of the blood. Hopefully you remember this already. The osmotic pressure of the blood, which is mainly due to the high concentration of proteins in the blood, is sucking. It's very hypertonic to the surrounding tissue fluids, so it's sucking some of the fluid back into the exiting portions of the capillaries. And along with that fluid getting sucked in there, you have CO2, you have waste and so forth, like urea and uric acid, things that need to be taken away from these tissues so that they don't build up and become toxic. So that's just a quick review of your basic capillary bed function within a tissue. Now we have a little bit of a problem here. More fluid gets squeezed out of the blood on this side of the capillary bed due to that hydrostatic pressure pushing the fluid out. More gets squeezed out than gets sucked back in on this side. Osmotic pressure sucks. It sucks the fluid back in from the surrounding tissue fluids. I'm stealing Miss Nick's little saying to help you remember hydrostatic versus osmotic. More fluid is pushed out over here than is sucked back in over here. So guess what? And that has to be that way. Otherwise, you would have this equal amount of fluid being pushed out that was being taken back in, and it would be very difficult to deliver the good stuff and take away the bad stuff from a tissue. That causes a problem, though. More fluid's being pushed out than is being taken back in, so you got to have some way to get rid of that extra fluid. If you don't, sorry about that. What was the chance my cell phone would go off in the middle of a video lecture? As I was saying, If you didn't have some way to get rid of this excess fluid, it's not just going to evaporate out of these tissues. If you don't have a way to get rid of it, that tissue would just keep swelling and swelling and swelling and swelling with the increased fluid. So that is where your lymphatic system comes in. These little, represented here by these little green blood vessels. These little tiny, and at this level they're called lymphatic capillaries when they're really especially tiny, microscopic level when you're getting down into, zooming into a particular tissue location. The job of these lymphatic capillaries is to function like little drainage ditches for the excess tissue fluids that build up in that location. And if we zoom into one of these, that's what you see down here. One thing you'll notice, a lymphatic capillary has a closed end. Okay, it's not a circulation, so it's not just a continuous type system of blood vessels like you have with your arteries and veins. They're closed on one end. We're not going to get into a lot of the details of the structure, but their walls, the walls of these lymphatic capillaries are very thin. They're one cell thick, endothelial type cell, same in a sense very much like the cells that line the walls of your capillaries. And notice that these lymphatic capillaries have these flap-like mini valves. That just means that the walls have little flaps in them that open up and allow fluid, excess fluid as it builds up, to squeeze past the flap and into these little tiny vessels. So tissue fluids are moving in there, but not only that, let's say within this tissue you have some bacteria. Maybe this is the dermis of your skin, you've cut yourself with a knife, some little bacteria have gotten down into the tissue. Some of those bacteria will also wind up flowing into these lymphatic capillaries as well. Keep that in mind because that winds up being important for the function of your immune system. All right, so most tissues in your body have these little lymphatic capillaries which are serving like little drainage ditches to drain this excess fluid off of your tissues. However, there are some spots in your body that don't have them. Your bones don't have lymphatic capillaries. Teeth, bone marrow actually does not. And also the central nervous system, brain and the spinal cord, you don't have lymphatic capillaries running through those tissues. When you learn about the digestive system, you may learn about these specialized lymph capillaries that are present along the within the wall of your intestinal tract. We'll leave that for later in the semester when you learn about the digestive system. They play an additional role in helping to absorb nutrients from your digestive tract and delivering those to the blood. All right, let's see. I really need a picture here. I'm better with pictures. Okay. You guys can read what I'm about to say on this slide, but while I'm talking about it, I'm going to use the picture. So if you imagine those little tiny microscopic lymphatic capillaries are present collecting excess tissue fluids from most tissues in your body. And then those little microscopic capillaries, they're all going to flow together and merge into larger lymphatic vessels. And then those are going to flow together and merge into larger collecting vessels. Okay, so it's kind of like what you have with your blood vessels. More little tiny microscopic ones lead to bigger ones, which lead to still bigger ones. And then finally you get to those large ones that you're learning about in the anatomy portion of the course at this point. So this diagram is showing you where you have these major collecting vessels. And then it's also showing you some of the locations where you have larger lymph nodes lying along those vessels. And we'll talk more about lymph nodes in a minute. The lymph nodes, their job will be to filter these lymph fluids passing through these larger vessels. Now, where is all this lymph fluid going to go? It's going to get filtered by the lymph nodes. And if you notice, there's one major lymphatic vessel called the thoracic duct. And it's flowing upward from your abdominopelvic cavity into the thoracic cavity. And then it makes a loop around here. And it connects to the left subclavian vein. Okay, and it's the reason it's doing that is it is returning this filtered lymph, this fluid, back into the bloodstream. Now, if you notice here on this diagram, everything you see there shaded in red, all of the left side of the body and the right side of the body as well, from about this level down, all of the lymph fluid collected from all of those tissues eventually drains into this thoracic duct. And then the thoracic duct takes that fluid and dumps it into the left subclavian vein. Okay. What about the rest of the body? So the right side of the head, the right arm, the right side of the thorax, the lymph draining off of those tissues gets filtered through lymph nodes, and it eventually drains into, it's very hard to see, but it drains into a lymphatic vessel called the right lymphatic duct. And then that dumps this fluid into the right subclavian vein. Okay, so different parts of the body are the fluid is ultimately collected into those two major vessels which dump that fluid back into the left or the right subclavian vein. Okay, how does this fluid get, does it get, I almost said circulated, I have to watch myself. Lymph does not circulate. How is lymph transported? What makes it move? The heart is not pushing it like it pushes your blood. Basically, the pressure is pretty low in the lymphatic system, and it's actually relying on the pulsations of nearby arteries to help pump it through those vessels. And also, some of the larger lymphatic vessels do have smooth muscle tissue in the walls, and that smooth muscle tissue contracts and helps squeeze some of the lymphatic fluid along as well. Also, contraction of your muscles as well, your skeletal muscles, will help squeeze some of that lymph along the way. Let's think too a little bit about what happens if your lymphatic system gets blocked. If you have a blockage and those lymphatic vessels are not draining a tissue properly, you can have swelling is what will happen, because the excess fluid in the tissues will build up and build up and build up. That's why women who have breast cancer surgery and they have lymph nodes and some associated lymphatic vessels removed from around the area where a breast has been removed, it's not unusual at all for them to have problems with swelling in places like their upper arm, and that's because of the reduced number of lymphatic vessels that are available to drain those tissues, so they can have trouble getting that fluid out of areas that were adjacent to the breast tissues that were removed. Also, there's a very horrible parasite that can block lymphatic vessels and cause a disease called elephantiasis. You may have seen pictures of this before, where the people who have this disease wind up with enormous limbs because they simply cannot drain the fluid off of those tissues, and they just get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. It's pretty grotesque. So the lymphatic system is kind of important for healthy tissues. Now, what about the cells of the lymphatic system? So we've talked about the blood vessels. What about the cells? The key cells of your lymphatic system are the ones that are involved in your immune system function, and lymphocytes which maybe you identified in lab under the microscope, lymphocytes are the chief ones that we will find within the lymphatic tissues. We'll also find macrophages, which are cells that engulf bacteria and viruses and damaged tissues that are left over and need to be cleaned up. There's another type of cell called dendritic cells. They play an important role in your immune system as well, but you'll learn more about those in your microbiology class. Among your lymphocytes, you have two major types. They're called T cells or B cells, T lymphocytes or B lymphocytes. Maybe you've heard of those before. We'll talk a little bit more about those when we cover the immune system. All right, now what are these lymph nodes? What are these lymph nodes? They occur in clusters along lymphatic vessels. These are the locations where lymphatic fluids draining off of your tissues are filtered, especially to try to remove invading microorganisms, to try to combat infection. And they're generally named, many of them are named according to the location of the body where they occur. You may have even learned that in Biology 201 when you did the initial gross anatomy study and looked at the human torso models. Your inguinal lymph nodes are down in the inguinal region of the body, down in the groin. Axillary lymph nodes are the ones in your armpits. They're in the axillary region. Cervical lymph nodes are in your neck. Those are the ones that we're generally the most familiar with because those are the ones that get swollen when we have infections in the back of your throat and your pharynx. If you zoom in on the inside of a lymph node and look at it at a very detailed level, you would see that you have a very web-like framework in here, and that is because you have a lot of reticular fibers. Those are protein fibers that are similar to collagen fibers. Lymph nodes, if you think about them as being these little round spherical objects, they're filled with a web of these reticular fibers, which is great because those little fibers can trap things that are floating through a particular lymph node. You have space in here between all those fibers. The spaces are called sinuses. You have these lymphocytes that are kind of hanging out along these fibers. And then you'll also have macrophages, these cells that are good at engulfing and digesting things that are foreign to your body. So there's a macrophage that's hanging out along some of this web work in a lymph node. And you also have cells that are just part of the structure of a lymph node and make these reticular fibers that you need on the inside of the lymph node as well. So this is great. You've got these lymphocytes and these macrophages, and they're hanging out in the lymph nodes, and they're waiting to intercept microbes that are flowing in here from your tissues. So it's kind of a nice little setup. Let's see. This is a diagram from your book, and we've kind of looked at this already. The main point here is, again, just to remind you, the names of a lot of lymph nodes are based on the region of the body where they occur, and we're not going to go any further with it than that. All right, lymph node function. I think we've already covered this already, but there's some text for you to accompany your notes. Here's what a lymph node, a typical lymph node looks like. If you sliced one in half and looked on the inside, and we're not going to get into a lot of the nitty-gritty details here, but I do want to point out a few things. Over here, these are lymphatic vessels that are connected to this particular lymph node, and these are the vessels that are bringing fluid in. So they're bringing the fluid in, and they're called afferent lymphatic vessels. And you'll have several of these connected to a particular lymph node that are bringing fluid in from different tissues. Over on the other side of the lymph node, you have just a couple of exiting vessels over here. These are called your efferent lymphatic vessels. Okay, and you have the fluid that's exiting over here, and that fluid has been filtered as it passes through the lymph node. So fluid comes in here and here, etc., from these afferent vessels, and it just kind of percolates through the vessel. It's all very, not through the vessel, through the lymph node. It's very webby in here, like we looked at over on the other diagram. You've got the lymphocytes hanging out there. The macrophages are lurking there, waiting to intercept nasty little creatures that might be draining in from your tissues. Let's see. These little purple areas that are called germinal centers, we're not going to get into a lot of the details on those. Those are places where if these lymphocytes do detect a foreign invader that needs to be responded to, they will respond and they will multiply inside the lymphatic vessel. And that lymphatic vessel will get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger when that happens, and that's why it swells when you have a particular infection. Another good thing about a lymph node, since you've only got a couple of vessels going out and a whole bunch of vessels going in, that kind of creates some back pressure here and slows down this whole process of filtering. It takes a while for the stuff that's coming in through these afferent vessels to be completely filtered before they wind up exiting. You wouldn't want that stuff just zipping through a lymph node really quickly, because then you might not capture all the bad stuff that might be in there. Otherwise, don't worry about the various details there of the inside of a lymph node. Okay, so that fluid gets filtered by the lymph nodes, and it is going to eventually drain into the thoracic duct. The filtered fluid enters into the subclavian veins on either side, depending on what part of the body you're draining. Okay, another organ of the lymphatic system that we should talk about is the spleen. Now, in contrast to the rest of the lymphatic system, which tends to deal with this lymph fluid and filtering it and returning it to the blood, the spleen, hang on, my pen has turned off here. The spleen filters, its job is to, I know I'm writing like a 3-year-old here, filters the blood. But it does it in a very similar way to how your lymph nodes filter the lymph fluid. So it is included within the lymphatic system. You also have lymphocytes that lurk in the spleen as well, and macrophages. So it functions kind of like a big old giant lymph node that's filtering the blood instead of the lymphatic fluids. Main functions: cleanses the blood of aged cells and platelets and any debris that may be passing through there. Also microbes as well, microorganisms. If they get into your bloodstream, you're not supposed to have microorganisms in your bloodstream, but these cells of your immune system that lurk in the spleen can intercept those if they are in the blood as well. Here is a nice, delicious looking picture of a real spleen and a real human, and hopefully you guys remember that the spleen is in your left upper quadrant of the abdominopelvic cavity along the posterior wall over on that side, not too far away from your left kidney, sitting right there below the diaphragm. The splenic artery, which is shown right here, you know, they don't look nice and bright red like they do on a lab model. Splenic artery is bringing blood to the spleen, and let's see, splenic vein is not shown here. Splenic vein takes filtered blood away from the spleen, so keep that in mind. Within the spleen, we're not going to get into a lot of gory details here with the spleen either. There are two parts of the spleen. There are areas that are called white pulp within the spleen that, kind of like lymph nodes, has lots of lymphocytes, hanging out on reticular fibers. It's really webby and fibery in there. They're hoping to intercept bacteria, viruses, yeast, whatever might be inappropriately flowing through your bloodstream. And then you also have areas that are called red pulp. And the red pulp area, very rich in macrophages. So macrophages aren't just for intercepting bacteria and viruses and things like that. They also are supposed to engulf and digest your own cells and tissues that need to be replaced. So that includes worn out red blood cells. You know, they live about 30 days and then they wear out and have to be replaced. And platelets as well. Now this is showing us a nice little picture here. If we cut your spleen open, here's the big splenic artery, or splenic artery, bringing oxygenated blood to the spleen. Here's your splenic vein that's taking away deoxygenated blood with waste and so forth in it. But this blood is also, that's being taken away from the spleen, has been filtered. And if we kind of zoom in over here, so this blood that's coming in from the splenic artery, it branches out into smaller and smaller little arteries. And then the blood actually exits those blood vessels. So it's actually out here in these spaces that you see here. Within those spaces in the white pulp area, you have lymphocytes that are hanging out there hoping to intercept bacteria and viruses and so forth that may be passing through. Let's get rid of those. They're not supposed to be in your blood. And in the red pulp area, you have macrophages that are going to bind to old, worn-out red blood cells and platelets and engulf those and digest those and break those down and hopefully recycle a lot of those parts for future use. And then once that blood has been filtered, you've gotten rid of all of that old, nasty stuff. That blood moves back into these veins, and eventually all of those veins in the spleen lead to the big splenic vein, which is going to take it away from the spleen. All right, that's about all we're going to cover for the function of your spleen. Now, a lot of you guys too, though, you know that you can get by without a spleen. You know, a lot of people have a splenectomy; their spleens are removed. You may be thinking, well, if I lose my spleen, how are my old red blood cells and platelets going to be gobbled up and destroyed when all those old cells just hang out in my bloodstream forever and build up to incredibly high levels? Fortunately not. You do have macrophages in your liver as well, and as you know, the liver also filters the blood. And so those macrophages can take over for that job if you wind up losing your spleen. What about the thymus? We're really not going to spend a lot of time on the thymus at all. The thymus is a gland, which is, we can see where it is. Don't worry so much about the histology diagram down here. But the thymus sits on top of the heart. So it's superior to the heart. This is a location where your T lymphocytes mature here. You may remember earlier lecture we talked about how all of your blood cells are produced in your bone marrow, and that includes some immature T cells. Those immature T cells, though, then migrate to the thymus, and in the thymus they mature and become fully functional. The thymus changes in size with age, so it's biggest in infants and children. When you're a child, that's when your thymus is its biggest in size. This is when you're maturing the most T lymphocytes. When you become an adolescent, though, the thymus no longer needs to expand anymore, and as you become an adult, eventually it gradually atrophies or dies. And we're not going to get into a lot of the details of that. That does have to do with the fact that by the time you become an adult, you have built up a lot of immune memory. You have long-lived T cells that can help you fight many of the different types of infectious microbes that your body may encounter. and you no longer have a need to keep maturing more and more and more brand new T lymphocytes. All right, just think thymus T lymphocyte maturation. Think thymus, big, infants and childhood, declines with age, and you're probably going to be good. Okay, another type of lymphatic tissue, tonsils. Tonsils. These are almost like lymph nodes that exist in patches. Okay, and you have these around the pharynx, the back of your throat, and then up into that little compartment between your nasal cavity and the oropharynx, the part at the back of your throat. You have basically little patches of tissue here. You have your palatine tonsils, so they're the ones that are at the posterior end of your oral cavity. Along the palate, roof of your mouth, your lingual tonsils. Lingual refers to the tongue, like language, so they're at the base of the tongue. Your pharyngeal tonsils, they're up in your nasopharynx, passageway between nasal cavity and the oropharynx at the back of your throat. Those are the ones that we also call adenoids. Then you also have some called tubal tonsils. Those are the ones that are around where your eustachian tubes or auditory tubes connect to the pharynx. Yeah, and here's a diagram of where these are located. There's your palatine tonsils. Pharyngeal tonsils or adenoids are up there. Lingual tonsils back here on the underside of the tongue. Tonsils are, again, they're kind of like a lymph node, except they're not receiving lymph fluids. They're not draining lymph fluids. They're located in these positions because very good location for intercepting. You're breathing in bacteria. You're breathing in mold spores. You're breathing in viruses. So it's good that we have these little patches of tissues with lymphocytes and macrophages lurking there to hopefully intercept these horrible, evil little creatures that are going to try to do us harm in some cases. So that's why they're located there. Those are tonsils. Again, we're not going to go into gory details about tonsil structure. Then I also want you to be aware that you have, in addition to tonsils, you have patches of tissue like that in other locations. You have Peyer's patches. These are down in the intestinal tract, the small intestine. Your appendix has some of this lymphatic type tissue as well. You also have little lymphoid nodules along the linings of your respiratory tract as well that are kind of like tonsils in many ways. Together, there is a term MALT that refers to all of these tissues together. It stands for mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue. So anywhere where you have a mucosal lining, well, not anywhere, but in many places where you have a mucosal membrane, especially along your digestive tract and your respiratory tract, you have these patches of tissue, and that's a good thing because those are places where microorganisms like bacteria and viruses tend to enter the body. So those are great places to have these tissues to intercept those nasty little vermin who are trying to invade our bodies. All right, I think that is the end for the lymphatic system overview. I'm going to next talk about the immune system. It's going to be kind of a quick overview, and I'm going to divide that one up into two parts.